My question is, how does one know that Christianity is the one true way of living in a world that thinks that not one religion is superior than another and that we should all coexist? All religions should coexist.
Great question. So the question essentially is that given the world of pluralistic and multiple options, obviously, in terms of religious systems and even non-religious, and sort of the way the world culture goes is say that it's arrogant actually to say one way is the correct way. How can we actually know that there is one way? Let there be light. It's an excellent, excellent question. Fantastic question. I actually addressed this in Saving Truth, my latest book. I have a whole section on this. First is the underlying assumption that pluralism, it's a good thing in the sense that no one worldview becomes forcibly dominant over others. We can't enforce Christianity or enforce Islam or atheism on people. People are trying to do these things, but we shouldn't, because I don't think force actually leads to truth. I think debate, civilized debate leads to truth, and the problem with the statement that all religions are equal or maybe equally invalid shuts down debate. When you call someone intolerant, you're no longer actually engaging in debate. You're just simply shutting them up. That's a way to force non-discussion. So we hear this phrase, right? All roads lead to God. You've heard this phrase most likely, and most likely some of you have heard this phrase, all roads lead to God. You've heard this, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the problem. The statement, all roads lead to God, is meant to respect all roads as if they're equally valid. It doesn't actually respect all roads. It disrespects all the roads because they don't even claim to lead to God. So if you're saying all roads lead to God, you're not taking any of them seriously. How do I know this? Let's take a look at Buddhism. Buddhism, as Buddha taught it, didn't teach you and me that we are going to go to heaven. It taught us that we don't even have a self. The self is an illusion. All we are is an accretion of karma. And that once you, whoever you is actually, works off your karma through the cycle of death and rebirth, you become extinguished. You don't go to God. Hinduism tells you that you are God. And that I'm God and you are God. Now, you're not a God, and I'm not a God. We are all the God. So we're under the illusion of separateness. That is not the same thing that Islam teaches, which is that there is a God out there who is not me, and that I am not to have relationship with him beyond master and servant. And that's all there is to it. And that when I go to heaven, I go to a paradise God creates for me, but he himself is not there. Christianity says that we were made to be in relationship with God, which is why Genesis chapter 3 says that God walked and talked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. And we are eventually going to get back to the state where we see God face to face, where we're actually engaged in relationship eternally from him. So you see how all roads don't even claim to lead to God? So when you say all roads lead to God, you're not respecting them, you're disrespecting them because you're not taking them seriously. I respect the Muslim too much to say, you and me believe the same thing.
Yeah.
And they're diametrically opposed. I believe that God is triune, one in his nature, three in his persons. And because of that, God is truly great. A Muslim would say that's blasphemy. I take it seriously. So how do I know then? Once we understand that this idea that they're all equally valid can't possibly be true, they could all be equally invalid, but they can't also all be the same. Now the question is, how do we know that Christianity is also true? I love the way you phrased the question because it wasn't just, how do we know they're false? That isn't it. It's how do you know this is true? And that comes back to me on two claims. First, that there is a God that exists, and I have numerous philosophical arguments. Vince gave some on the scientific level, but I think there's also philosophical arguments as well to believe that there is a God. The very fact that the universe itself, the universe is contingent. In other words, it depends on something else to explain itself. Ultimately, you have to have a being. You have to stop somewhere. Everything that exists must be explained by something else unless you come to an unexplained first cause. That's what God is. For a number of other reasons, I believe that God exists. But why the Christian God? Because Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, incarnate, who takes away the sins of the world. And then he dies on a cross, and then he rises from the dead. Now, if he was wrong, he would have stayed dead. If he was right, he would have risen from the dead, because they asked him a very reasonable question. They said, John chapter 2 and in other places, by what authority do you do these things? Who do you think you are? And he says, when you destroy this temple, meaning my body, I will raise it up again in 3 days. That's either true or it's false. An opinion is irrelevant. So if he died and stayed dead, we would have no reason to believe him. If he died and rose again, we have every reason to believe him. People often ask me, why Jesus and not Muhammad or Buddha or Confucius or Krishna? Here's the reason. Jesus died and rose from the dead, and guys who rise from the dead tend to have credibility. So the question then becomes, how do you know that he rose from the dead? Without making a longer answer even longer, let me suggest this. I've done numerous debates online, and we can get into this more, maybe some more questions about the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I have 4 facts that are strong facts. In other words, scholars, whether they're Christian or atheist or whatever, who study the historical Jesus, say is true about this historical Jesus. 1, that he died by crucifixion. We have to have a death before we have a resurrection. That's kind of how it works. And that's historically accurate. John Dominic Crossan says that his death by crucifixion is as sure a fact as any ever could be. Then we have the appearances to the disciples of the risen Jesus. Skeptical, non-Christian historians say that the disciples saw something that convinced them that they saw not the surviving Jesus, not the escaping Jesus, but the actual resurrected Jesus. So we see that. So we see that the appearance of the disciples. Then we see the skeptics, Paul and James. They're converted. James was a skeptic. You read this in the Gospels. Paul was an enemy of the Christian faith. I'm a trial lawyer. Now, when you have somebody on the other side who disagrees with you so very violently in that sense that they're like the worst witness you could possibly have on the other side of you, but they suddenly switch their position because they realize you're right. What do you do with that witness? You put him on the stand, and you let him talk for days and days and days to the jury. The best kind of eyewitness testimony is somebody who thought you were so wrong, who now thinks you're right, and it costs them something, too, to say it. They're not just making it up. It costs them something. That's exactly what you have in Paul. It cost Paul everything. He was an enemy of the Christian faith and switched and claimed to be the champion of the Christian faith based on his claim, I saw him with my own eyes. If he didn't, he knew he was lying. Why would you die on purpose for something you knew was purposely a lie? That gets you nowhere. So we have the crucifixion, the appearances of the disciples, the skeptics, Paul and James converted, and then you have the empty tomb. We know where it was. It was a Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. We know that it was empty. And the fact that women were the first disciples is what's called an embarrassing admission. That wouldn't be necessarily included in a factual claim unless it was true. And that we knew it was where it was, and we knew that 3 days later, his tomb was empty. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is both a sword and a shield. It defends against the attacks of Christianity. But it also offers you and me the hope that we will be raised as he is raised, because he claimed and he said we would. But it's also a sword in that it says that everything that comes against it is therefore false. So if you want to contend with the Christian faith, you contend with this central fact, the fact that says all other claims that deny the resurrection can't be true, but this one is true. And it's not just true in a way that excludes you. It's a way that it's true in that it includes you. He didn't die and rise for Christians. That doesn't even make any sense. He died and rose so that we could all know Jesus, know God. That's the whole point.